from SPP and Shaun from EPRI here to talk to you about grid modernization initiatives. Again, the presentations will be open at the end, and we will have CLEs provided to you. And as soon as this session is over, we do have an announcement about the rest of the conference series that we hope you will find interesting. So with that, I will hand it over to, don't know, let's see who we got going first. Yeah, no, it is Shaun, yes.
All right, well, thanks very much. I need to start by saying thanks for sticking around and follow that up with, I didn't realize that I was going to be following a session that would have a very active discussion of time of use rates. My presentation features time of use rates, not always in a positive light. And that's not meant to be a commentary on Missouri's specific time of use rates. It's when you bring a bunch of modeling nerds together, let them sort of run free, these are the outputs that they produce. I'm just here to report out on that. So it's not specific to Missouri or Kansas. It's just these are general findings from the modeling that we did. Anyway. Is this? Yes. Okay. So first of all, the Electric Power Research Institute. If you haven't heard of us, this is our slide. We've been around for a bit more than 50 years. We cover everything that electric power people care about, from nuclear power plants, generation in general, transmission and distribution, all the way down to consumer side devices and sort of the telecom and the cyber and AI and everything else that overlays. So the idea is to try to do everything, everything for everybody. It's about a $450 million per year worth of spending. The graphics, I thought that sending PDF would save them, but anyway. It's about a $400 million per year global spend. That's something like 1,500 people in the Institute. So if you've met some of us, you've met some of us, there's more of us. It's a decent sized group. Let's see, what else is important? Oh, and it's a nonprofit. So we don't do pay for results. And so today I'm specifically going to talk about it's grid flexibility initiative that occurred over 2 years, involved about 20 different researchers, was broken into 3 different work streams. All right, so if you think about the body of work, it's something like 500 pages of research results that were published. I'm going to summarize it down into about 5-ish pages. And it was specifically on the impacts of, if you can control loads, how does that impact your planning? How does that impact how you operate the power system? Right, this is something that everyone has sort of been touching on for a long time, with demand side resources, distributed energy resources, all those sorts of things. This was looking specifically at, like, what are the resources you should work on in work stream 1? How do you integrate those in your planning processes, work stream 2? And then how do you integrate that into your operations in work stream 3? And specifically the part that I was involved with was work stream 2, looking at the grid planning processes. So I think we've covered this pretty well. There are broadly 4 sets of planning processes that occur at utilities that are technical processes. In addition to this, there's also like regulatory planning and rates planning and load forecasting, those sorts of things. These are the, I don't want to call anyone non-technical, but these are the areas that were in focus for this work. So we did capacity expansion, just sometimes referred to as resource planning. We did resource adequacy, which I think we covered a bit enough today that everyone knows what it is. Transmission planning, and then distribution planning. And the goal was to look at, for each one of these, how do we take the existing tools and planning methods and apply, load management to them to see what is the outcome, like what is worth further investigation. And for each one of them, unfortunately, each one studied a different area. It'd be nice if they all studied the same area, because then the results would be comparable to each other. But each one studied a different area, because the reality of the situation is that if you go to a researcher and say you've got a very limited budget to do this, limited amount of time to do this, they're going to say, okay, I'll use the model I've already got. and I'll modify that. And so each of the different planning groups, the researchers had different models that they could work with. So we ended up having different focus. So some of the results are national and some of them are regional from the different regions. And the reason why that matters is because different regions of the country use different amounts of energy on a baseline basis. And the way that we modeled the results was to increase the loads on an annual energy basis to include these additional flexible loads. So we increase the loads by 10 to 13% for each region. And if you're looking at the Southwest area where there's relatively little air conditioning because most of the population lives in the marine coastal environment where loads are very light and there's high population density. You compare that to the Southeast where people consume much more on a per capita basis. There's more industrial load on a per capita basis. Then adding 10% load of flexible load is going to be a different amount on a per capita basis for the different regions. So the results are not directly comparable, but they are what they are. And in this case, most of the focus was on adding electric transportation, flexible loads that are electric transportation. So EVs that are unmanaged charging, basically. There's also some modeling of building loads, but the results from that were nominal. They were not seen to be very impactful in this modeling process. So the highlights here is that overall, looking at unmanaged versus managed, typically you're going to have a lower cost for the managed loads, which makes sense. Why else would you be managing them? The next highlight is that you end up with a different resource mix if you're doing resource planning. The biggest change, there's my laser. Biggest change is you see that there's a reduction in the need for energy storage, the 4-hour energy storage, because the distributed energy resources are effectively doing the same job that the stationary batteries would be doing. It also somewhat unintuitively allows for more solar integration, which, you know, historically historically it's generally assumed that managed charging means more charging overnight. In this case, this was looking at a future scenario, so a scenario where there's lots of solar. And so the model ended up dispatching some of the EVs to charge in the middle of the day in order to increase their solar energy consumption, which whether that makes sense to you or not is a reasonable question. It's something like 50% of vehicles don't get used during the day, or they're at home during the day. So that was the reason why it felt right to have this kind of result come out of it. Looking at resource adequacy, this is the next result. You can see that the unmanaged loads, adding all additional load in an unmanaged fashion causes problems. When it's managed, those problems are minimized. And then also the same thing for the distribution. So looking at distribution, when the loads are not managed, the distribution line is overloaded. When they are managed, it's not overloaded. So to dig into one of these a little bit more specifically, you can see these are dollar per megawatt hour prices coming out of the US region process, which is the EPRI model that's used for resource planning across the different scenarios. The baseline is there's no electric vehicles, then you move across, and you can see the managed cases are broadly in line with the no EV cases. When you go to unmanaged, it's a bit more expensive, and the time of use rate model produces the most expensive outcome. The reason for that is because the time of use modeling assumes that the vehicles will be following the time of use behavior that we observe today. And today, if you put a vehicle on a time of use rate, the most common behavior is for the demand from those vehicles to spike at the beginning of that time of use rate period. So effectively, the load gathers up, and then it all occurs at the time, that's the beginning of the time of use period. So it causes a spike in demand that otherwise wouldn't exist. And this is expensive to serve. So that's the part that I wanted to point out is maybe a little bit uncomfortable to talk about, having just had a conversation about the adoption of time of use rates. This is the same thing in a little bit more detail. So this is the capacity additions. So this is a change in capacity nationwide in this modeling. You can see what those results look like, and then the generation mix in this sort of nominal 2050-ish type system, right? It's well enough into the future that you've got significant amounts of gas and gas with CO2 capture and sequestration. That's what the gas CCS is there. And then the final point is, well, actually, I'll skip over that one. The final point is that these cases didn't explicitly model coordination between the different planning models, right? Because like I said, they were looking at different regions, different scenarios. And so in order to make that realistic, we have this sort of expectation that there will be times when one part of the power system wants the load to do one thing, and another part of the power system will want the load to do something else. And in order to sort of illustrate what that might look like, we ran this case that was called the managed external, which is to say the EV load is being used for something other than distribution load management. Maybe it's being dispatched as a generation resource. And when it's released from that service, it acts just like a time of use rate does, which is to say, sort of bunches up the load and it causes a spike right when the loads are released from the generation service. So in this case, the illustration is, by solving a problem on the generation system, you might be causing a problem on the distribution system. And so what are the planning mechanisms? What are the planning metrics? What are the mechanisms that can be used to prevent that from causing undue cost or undue harm to the system? You can skip over this one. It's a summary, and then this is just the key insight summary. It's a great deck. There's a link down the bottom. If you're an EPRI member, you can download it for free. Everybody else, maybe find someone who's an EPRI member and they can send it to you because it's kind of expensive to pay for it. And so that was, there you go. And so that was it. That was, looking at EV managed charging as a way of integrating the loads into the system in order to minimize total costs for all loads. Oops, sorry, wrong way.
All right, is this one on? Okay. Good afternoon again. I guess you get me buy one, get one free or two for something. So good afternoon again. I do have a different message though, so hopefully it'll be valuable and different. So grid modernization is definitely a topic we could spend a lot of time on. We kind of joke a little bit within SPP about how much of the energy industry is changing, and really at this point it's what's not changing. I mean, it's even HR. I mean, it's just the way post-pandemic and how we've got to hire and how we've got to operate. I know the previous panel talking about Zoom, and just I know everybody in this room is dealing with that. But it's quite curious. Shaun talked about loads. We're actually in the middle of, I think I showed the GIQ and the state of the GIQ. 18 gigawatts of storage, right? But storage is not just a power source, when it discharges, but it's also a power sink. It's a load. And so it never fails that we have different novel, great ideas in this consistent regional or energy transition that we're in. But now we're operating the generator interconnection queue process, and FERC Order 841 drops. And they have, FERC has certain expectations to kind of embrace ESRs, which are great. That's good. I mentioned about resource adequacy and really operational tool. Batteries are a part of that. But even just of last few weeks, we were trying to sign some GIAs, and we didn't study them as a load. They didn't ask for firm service. And so now we have to spin up a certain amount of criteria. Well, then there's a certain amount of protection and assumptions that you make for a wholesale energy device that is withdrawing, is charging and discharging off the grid. And so we have to basically create policy and process near on the fly, but we have to do it reliably, but we can't overdo it. I think that's another aspect that we've really uncovered is there's a lot of, I would say, older style approaches to how we assess the grid. For instance, a battery that's 200 megawatt battery, large battery, right? If it's interconnected into the system, and basically part of 841 FERC basically says, you're not supposed to assign upgrades to the battery if it chooses not to charge during peak conditions. That makes perfect sense, because if they're building a battery for capacity, why on earth would they ever charge during peak condition? It just doesn't make sense. Well, the current rules are such that we would absolutely study them during extreme conditions. We would study them obviously as a generator, but when they charge, we would also plug them in a light load case. We would plug them in a winter case, and we would plug them in a summer case, and we would pretend like they were actually charging during summer peak conditions, which is ridiculous, because if they're offered into the market and they're a capacity accredited resource during peak conditions, and we're studying them to be able to kind of shift the load, then why on earth would we ever actually discharge them or charge them during peak conditions? But I'm just highlighting that as a very real world case that we're actively working on right now. And it's just an interesting test case to think, okay, 5-10 years ago, you could say, well, why didn't y'all think about that? Well, we were, starting a market, or we were adding another state to the RTO, or we were trying to, uncover another wind problem. And so it's just interesting, the whole modernization, because we have got to get a handle on it. It's not, I would say it's less about the engineering technical aspects of it as much as just the human. We talked about regulations. We talked about being able to, manage the barriers, but the GIQ is another one. You look, you hear all these press releases about GI, how much resources are in the queue, and the RTOs have this backlog and nothing's ever going to get built. I mean, I kind of mentioned, things do get built, right? We built a bunch of wind, but there is a backlog. So recognizing, but if you look at our queue process, it's over 20 years old. It was never meant, think about it. In 2002, did we have 100 gigawatt queues of generation looking to interconnect? And basically, it was never designed to do a wholesale energy mix swap. It just wasn't. It was designed for kind of a incremental. Oklahoma Gas and Electric wanted to build a peaker, and that's what it was designed for. Late 90s, early 2000s. Fast forward 20 years, we're still dealing with a queue-based least cost solution aspect to building new generation. And you couple that with usually wind and solar, ideal wind and solar, not residential, but ideal wholesale large solar farms, large wind farms are not where people live. And so you're not swapping out gas in the middle of Kansas City or Oklahoma City. You're actually trying to build a solar farm or a wind farm west of where people live, and then you're trying to import it in, which is also different from the least cost solution of incremental gas plants. I'm trying to paint this picture of modernization that we're hitting a saturation point on the grid, and it's not just SPP. They're all facing it. MISO, PJM, ERCOT, you name it, and everybody's kind of handling it a little bit different. But the reality is we have to build transmission. We have to build transmission. And I've been over GI. I've been responsible for GI for about a year now. And I'm sure everyone in this room has kind of taken a different role, and how long it kind of takes to get acclimated to the full breadth of the processes and procedures and all the nuances of whatever role you're in, and joining a different company or whatever. But once you've kind of experienced a little bit of GI and you fully appreciate and understand, we're at an impasse where you can blame the queue and you can blame this backlog. But what's actually happening is we are processing massive amounts of generation in pockets of the region, and it's hitting breaking points. It's just, you cannot build 20 gigs of solar and wind in Amarillo and Lubbock and expect the grid to just handle it. It just won't. And so we're defining the engineering aspects of the assumptions, and what ends up happening is it hits this breaking point. Well, what happens when we hit a breaking point in a transmission process? Does anybody know? What do we need to do? Just shout it out. Let's make this interactive. You got to build something. You got to assign upgrades, right? And so what's happening is we're at a saturation point where it's not terminal equipment, it's not reconductor, it's not these little onesie twosies. We're hitting breaking points where we're hitting stability issues, where it's hundreds of millions of dollars of VHV facilities, and it's getting assigned to a handful of solar farms or a handful of wind farms in West Oklahoma or West Kansas. And the developers are like, you're killing me. You're killing my project. And I'm telling, that's not me. I'm not killing it. It's, we're doing, you're putting it in this point where, it's ideal wind, it's ideal solar. So what do you think? I mean, what's a better example? It's like going to Disney and is maybe Fast Pass. Is it called Genie now? Where there's like an extra ticket. So in trying to manage the queue, they kind of do all these fake things to try to fake you out, like you're actually on a ride before the ride, and then they offer like an exception to you, so you go the Fast Pass. But the fact is, there's a reason why the ride is saturated. There's a reason why everybody wants to ride Space Mountain, and there's a reason why everybody wants to interconnect to the west side of Kansas. It's not because it's like ideal, location 5 states away. No, it's because everybody wants that sweet high capacity factor of solar or wind. And so they're all, clamoring to get there. And then we just run the process, and then we turn the crank, and guess what? It hits saturation points. So modernization, well, maybe I'll skip. I'll come back to that. But there's a solution to be had. And I've been told that FERC is actually working. They borrowed some of our design. They're working on a transmission planning order that's coming out in about a month, maybe less. And so hopefully what they come out with is closer to what we're designing and working towards, and doesn't derail us, but we'll work on that. So this was just a couple of weeks ago. If you notice the dates, the wind curtailment, as you can see in this graph, the load is the blue. This is, I guess, a 7-day profile. And then this is the wind. There's a number. So whenever I see this coming up, you can almost guarantee that it's going to curtail, it's going to clip right at about 22 gigs. That's just, it's almost like we have just little bets between us at SPP on, where do you think the wind's going to be? Because it's certainly not going to be over 100%. We have to have there's a lot of phenomenon that's going on, that you have to have a certain amount of thermal on, because you can't shut down the coal overnight and then turn it right back around. So you have to kind of ride through some of these high wind days and so forth. And then, this is multiple days. I mean, this is a day and a half. I think these are 12-hour blocks. And then it drops. So you have to have a certain amount of generation to kind of carry forward through there. But basically, what this is trying to illustrate is opportunity, economic opportunity. The yellow is gigawatt hours, 210 gigawatt hours of curtailment across 36 hours. It's a massive amount of power that just poof, we didn't capture it. It's gone. We're, not stored. We have maybe 20 megawatts of storage right now, but it's not stored anywhere. To any real degree. It's just gone. And so this is just a random March day, and it's just trying to illustrate that there's opportunity to be had. And really the reason why this was spilled is because of lack of transmission. We couldn't get it anywhere else away from SPP. So I know this is a busy slide, but going back to the whole queue example, someone, I didn't make this up, but I think it's pertinent. Cost allocation is a race that no one wants to win. And I love that phrase. And I don't know, it is true. If you visualize a race, and maybe a horse race, and the horse that's winning, you're kind of betting that they don't win, because if they hit that finish line, and this is by tariff, I mean, this is SPP's tariff. Most other RTOs do the same thing. But if you're a GI customer and you hit that finish line before, let's say, a regional transmission planning process hits, or let's say another GI customer, maybe a lower queued customer, guess who gets hit with the bill? Guess who gets hit with the assigned upgrades? That horse that just won. And we're hitting these saturation points where it's not just 2 million, 5 million that is palatable for some of these, new farms and their business case. It's hundreds of millions of dollars that are getting hit to just a handful of customers. And what do you think happens? Their business case is killed. They withdraw from the queue, and the cycle just repeats. And it's just, for me, it's like seeing that. Going back to my this last year, I see this, and I was also responsible for transmission planning for about 5 years before that. And it's just, it kills me almost inside because it's a viable project. This is not, I'm not talking about speculative projects. I'm talking about viable projects. And we have load to serve, and we have an energy crisis, and we have resource adequacy problems and challenges that we need additional fuel mix. So you couple all these things together and you say, why are we doing this? Why are we applying a $300 million project to 5 projects and killing it, and then just kicking the can to the next cluster and expecting the next cluster to either pick up the bill, which they're not going to do, or they're going to tank and then just rinse and repeat, 4 clusters down. Eventually we'll have a regional plan that's going to pick up maybe some of that project, but we're not looking at it holistically is the challenge. So this is just kind of a pretty way of helping illustrate the different, the top left is our regional planning process, which we do integrate reliability planning. We try to predict economics. But the bottom is a novel approach that basically boils down to this. It's going to be an entry fee based holistic approach to where you have a collection of GI customers come to the plate, and we're going to future cast what their ticket is, a ticket to ride. It's basically their genie pass or their fast pass. And they say, look, they're going to pay their portion of the upgrades necessary to offset what the load would otherwise pay, and we would actually build this next layer of transmission across the states. That's the core of consolidated planning process. And so far, what's really it's a little bit scary, I think, how much consensus we have. we have so much consensus by the states, by the loads, all the various members that we have, by the developers themselves. So everyone is all in. I think once we start coming up with the real dollars from the next plan, we'll see where everybody really what they really think about it. But ultimately, the idea is we have to build more transmission. The loads are going to ultimately have to pay. They're not hitting necessarily BC ratios to the massive extent. But if the GI customers pay their fair share, then everyone wins. They get to interconnect. They don't have an exorbitant amount of the percentage of the next layer of EHVs, but the load also gets an offset because the GI customers are guaranteeing a certain amount that they're paying with their entry fee. So when we talk about modernization, we could go a bunch of different ways, but at least this is kind of our way of looking at large impact. And once we unlock the queue and actually build some things, then that's modernizing the grid, even if it's with typical transmission. One last thing, and then I guess we can open up the questions for both of us. But just wanted to talk a little bit about grid enhancing technologies. So just to be clear, GETS is getting a lot of airtime, and rightly so. It's not the silver bullet that we need. Transmission is the silver bullet we need. Generation is the silver bullet we need. Just time, it's nothing new. What's new is the technology's way to incorporate solar versus 40 years ago, but it's still, we need resources to perform, and we need transmission to interconnect everything. That's not going away. But what we see with grid enhancing technologies is a low hanging fruit, high net value, and we're seeing this phenomenon. I mentioned earlier, we had over $4 billion of upgrades that are out there. It's out of our hands. They're notice to constructs, go do. And they're taking not 4 years to build, but 7 years to build, 10 years to build. That's, you've heard probably the supply chain issues. You've heard all of these different challenges. You can't even get transformers. Some of our TOs are saying we're ordering transformers. We don't even give them the specs. We're just putting ourselves in the queue, and we don't even know what we're going to get. We just know we need it at certain dates. It's recognizing that that's happening, period. So what do we do about it? Let's see if we can embrace some of these technologies. I'm not going to go through all this in a technical manner, other than just there are still some barriers to these things. But take, for instance, fax devices. If we've already identified a bottleneck on the system, we've already identified an NTC. So let's say we were able to get it through our normal process today, which we have in some cases, and it's maybe 4 or 5 years out before they build. And we've got wind farms that are contingent on those facilities. They can't even operate to some extent. Well, what you could do is leverage some of these fax devices, install them on the transmission system, and maximize the capacity factor for the period of time before, as a temporary interim solution, as even an interim GIA. And then when the permanent solution comes into play, you can actually move those devices to some other congested area. Now, another problem is who pays for that, right? Who pays? Is it the individual developers? Is it the load in the transmission zone? So we're trying to work out those things. ARRs, DLRs, dynamic line ratings, those are nothing new. But what's new is just kind of the general push with FERC Order 881 for the ambient air ratings. I can say that, and this was many jobs back, but I looked at all the ratings, and we have some TOs that really don't even change the ratings ever. That might be that's not my prerogative. It's not my transmission system. So we have various TOs, and they all have their own authority over their TO methodology. But when you have a 100-degree differential on the SPP system and you have conductor limited, it is an area where you question, can we maximize use better, especially now that we have a marketplace for the last 10 years that kind of helps that price transparency. We know what it's actually cost the market when we can just relax certain ratings during certain ideal conditions. And then the last one is topology optimization. So we're looking at that. We actually have that in our outage coordination process. This is kind of an interesting thing. So it makes operators super nervous when you rip up the grid, right? It's like, when you see a bunch of red on your flow gate list, and these are all the bottlenecks, and you go out to the floor, the last thing you want to do is just start opening breakers. I mean, it's problem solved, but you also just made your grid super, super weak. But there's some novel approaches out there, which is not necessarily ripping up the system. It's not necessarily opening lines. It can actually split substations, and operators have been doing this for a very long time. But I kind of equate what we're doing is more of like, what's the IBM computer, Deep Blue, I guess, going against grandmasters. There's a reason why computers can kind of come up with different solutions 12 buses out. Human operators, I don't care if you have 30 years experience, you don't fully appreciate and understand how the interconnectedness works to be able to come up with some of the novel solutions that we can see. And the question is, can we actually apply that for temporary, almost like a remedial action scheme, but you kind of set up the system to be able to maximize revenue and economics of the generation, maximize energy without introducing reliability. That's the key piece, is making sure that these types of solutions don't introduce adverse conditions. So I think that's all I had, really. And we could probably talk for a long time about all kinds of modernization problems. So.
Well, thank you, Casey. Thank you, Shaun. Please join me in thanking both of them. All right, so do we have any questions? Both have mics. Yes, in the back.
So on the transmission, mostly, Texas has had renewable energy zones and that kind of planning, and Kansas used to have a transmission development authority. They don't have it anymore. Nebraska, it's all public power, so they're very locally focused. Do we need more state involvement, or do we need less state involvement and, you know, kind of an overall picture to get the planning and the, well, not just the planning, but the actual installations up, transmission.
I guess a contingent, yes. It depends on what type of involvement the states would pursue. But I'll give you an example. Some of the NTC delays, basically the delays in transmission production and in-service dates, is directly related to the individual utilities' own priorities. So they may have a stack of projects they got to build. Well, they're gonna focus on what they think or is required by them, not necessarily regionally or even state focused. And so that's an area that we're kind of exploring to say, well, can we restack, not take it away? You know, I don't want to get in the ROFR and FERC Order 1000 and competitive, not even talk about that. Just say, or is there a way that we can help the individual TOs kind of stack the project for maximum benefit for the region or the state? So that's one area that they could probably help with.
How do you see the increase of DER impacting, particularly this last set of questions, right? And the visibility that you may need into the distribution grid before making changes that could have ripple effects at that level?
Yeah, the visibility is an interesting challenge. I think Joanne mentioned earlier around what the FERC order for DER is 2222. And right now it's a big challenge because we're not really structured to be able to you can, okay, one way of looking at it, let's say there's a bottleneck between Oklahoma City and Tulsa. So you just have kind of just in the middle of the footprint, it's just a bottleneck. You might have DERs, but I know you're kind of talking about the granularity between transmission and distribution, but even across the transmission, we're not really equipped to be able to, if you want to deploy all the Walmarts in Oklahoma, which is probably a significant amount of decent, response, we're not equipped to be able to manage where they actually may make it worse, is what I'm saying. So it could be worse depending on how we're modeled. And the market model itself is at the transmission node and it's nodal based. And so if FERC kind of pushes their hand on that, it's going to wreak havoc on kind of our overall approach. But to your point on the distribution piece, I do think that we're going to have to do additional modeling to make sure that we're capturing those net effects and making sure we're not weakening something else. You're gaining something on the transmission side and you're actually pushing the problem down.
Any other questions? Let's see. I thought I had a couple here. I can. I apologize, not working. So you had both of you had a lot of questions raised, actions currently be undertaken. But if, and I think I know the answer, but let me just ask it. What is the number one with a bullet issue that you see needing to be addressed?
Well, I mean, yeah, if we're talking specifically about the question of electric transportation integration into like the broader system for minimum impact, sort of the way that EPRI's been working the problem is right from the bottom up, right? Because the sort of the first impact is the customer load panel, or if you're a fleet, the first impact is the on-site charging upgrades, and then the second impact is the service design, right? If you're having a new utility service, and then the third impact is distribution, and then on your way up. And so, certainly there are coordination issues, coordination questions between the different levels, the distribution versus transmission priorities. I would say, in my opinion, it's something where you work from your load way up and sort of prioritize them that way.
Yeah, I think for me, it's hard to decide between transmission and resource adequacy. In terms of modernizing the grid and being able to handle everything that's in front of us, we're going to need both. We're going to need transmission, and there's interregional plans. I think you may have heard the JTIQ that we did with MISO, the Joint Targeted Interconnection Queue. DOE actually gave us an award of $464 million to help offset the costs of those 5 projects. That's just the tip of the iceberg, though. It's just an example of what's necessary and needed across the country is more transmission to be able to unlock and access the new resources we need. So.
I don't know. I was trying. I thought that was feedback on my part, but I think it's elsewhere. What's that? Oh, was it? Okay. Are there any other questions? All right. Well, like I said, we had a missing speaker, so this one was cut a little short. Shaun, Casey, thank you very much. Casey, thank you for batting twice. Really do appreciate it. Really good. Well, as I had mentioned, that there are a couple of announcements that I wanted to make, and the first and foremost, if you're not aware, MEI runs the Midwest Energy Policy Series on infrastructure, energy efficiency, and economic development. Another large energy conference in Missouri is Advancing Renewables in the Midwest. That conference, we are collaborating with Columbia Water and Light to run. It will be held August 20th and 21st. So those dates and the Columbia has been determined. We have also, yes. It is the dates that are on there. Don't listen to me. I don't know what I'm talking about. So sorry. It is the 21st and 22nd in Columbia. And our goal there is to be able to provide you the same opportunities. What we found was 75% of the topics that we talked about at our energy efficiency conference and that happened at the Advanced Renewables Conference were the same, but there was only a 45-50% overlap with the audience. So looking to save you all some money and some time, we're putting these 2 conferences together, which will now be the Midwest Energy Policy Series on renewables and efficiency, 2 full-time days on those particular topics, opportunities for networking with contractors, utilities, and other partners. Through an initial survey, we expect to have at least 12 sessions during that time frame. And we have identified the first 6 that I wanted to share with you. This is the first time they've been shared. The first one is, it's called Views of the News. So it'll be analysis of the top energy news from the past year, what newsmakers and writers would think when they come up and covering news energy in the mainstream. So it's a combination of seeing what is hot, why it's hot, and then also if you're trying to get a connection with some journalists, some folks that are making news, what do you need to talk to them about? What's their angle? How do they look at energy? Is it too technical? Those type of things. Next will be a regional legislative and regulatory panel. So legislators and regulators from the Midwest in general will talk about the hottest local renewable and energy efficiency topics. The third will be the challenges and solutions in renewable energy deployment. We've heard part of that today is just on the transmission side. And I would think you also heard a little bit from Scott and David on the regulatory, the community engagement side. So we'll be talking about some case studies in that sector. The third one will be, the fourth one will be community engagement in renewable energy. The fourth one, my math is on, see, just like the dates, it's called about numbers, industrial energy efficiency strategies, and finally, case studies and best practices for implementing energy efficiency measures. We hope that, again, this is just the tip of the iceberg. We'll be sending out a survey to you all as well, post-event here to tell us what you thought about this event. We'll also be seeking some of your input for the upcoming events. That one and the other one that's on your brochure, which is December 12th in St. Louis. Did I get that day right? Okay, that one I got right. On energy economic development. So this event obviously cannot happen without you. It cannot happen without the MEI board, and it cannot happen without our sponsors or our staff. Matt and Ethan. So really want to thank you all. I hope you enjoyed the day, got something out of it, made some contacts. If you have any questions or thoughts, things that we can do better, things that we can do different, topics or speakers, That's what we want. These events are supposed to be about responding to the needs and the gaps and the issues that are pressing you. So thank you all again very much. I do appreciate it. I wish you all a safe trip back to your home, wherever that may be. Do remember that you can get your parking ticket validated outside. CLEs are provided. Presentations will be provided along with videos from this event will be online. So Matthew, Ethan, did I miss anything? Okay. Thank you all very much. Have a great day. Thank you, Casey, so much. Have a safe trip back. As always, you deliver. Thank you so much.